World War II was a display of carnage, blood, and cruelty. Every battle was won with a ruthless thirst for destruction. And no punishment seemed enough for those on the opposing side. The ability to inflict suffering on the enemy became the most important tactic. And there was only one limit: death. That would be the final fate for the ruthless German recruits who infiltrated the American ranks, seeking to create chaos and develop the brutal offensive in the Ardennes. These undercover Nazis were the protagonists of the worst deception of the war, and that betrayal unleashed extreme violence that would only be paid for in front of a firing squad, eager to collect the losses suffered with the same cruelty. After pulling the trigger, they would put an end to the infamous Operation Greif, one of Adolf Hitler's final blows before the fall of the Third Reich. In this new military history video, we will learn all about this incredible mission created to spread terror one last time. Join us to discover one of the bloodiest chapters of the fierce conflict. December 1944. Europe is drowning in a storm of destruction. The streets are littered with rubble and corpses. German power, which dominated the scene at the beginning of the war, is disappearing. The fierce clashes with the Soviet Union are no longer Adolf Hitler's only problem. The Normandy landing on June 6, 1944, completely changed the landscape of the conflict. The Third Reich lost thousands of men on the French beaches, their bodies abandoned, with their eyes open, staring at the sky and a horrible stench. But that was only the beginning. The devastating advance of the Western Allies was devouring the dream of a Nazi empire. The followers of the Führer continued to fall little by little, but he refused to give up. His orders remained the same: fight until the last drop of blood and finish off the enemy at any cost. They had to unleash a true hell. The German leaders' hopes were pinned on a risky plan: the Ardennes offensive. The dictator intended to round up all the men still holding out on the Western Front and send them into a brutal final battle. If he could tear through the Allied lines and divide his forces, he might be able to bring his enemy to his knees before the German troops were crushed. But if he failed, the Third Reich's army would disappear forever. However, amidst the horror, a darker operation emerged from the bowels of the Nazi machine. A task born of deceit, betrayal, and the promise of certain death for all those involved.
Hitler then began to plot one last grandstand to take advantage of the circumstances. During the Ardennes counteroffensive, Hitler expected to amass enough Nazi forces in the mountainous region in southeast Belgium and mount a counteroffensive attack against the scarcely stationed Allied forces. Hitler's ultimate goal was to cross through the Allied lines and retake the city of Antwerp and its vital port. To achieve this, he first needed to capture and destroy the Meuse river bridges, and he knew just who to call.
The plan soon became Operation Greif, and the man behind it would be Otto Skorzeny, a master of Nazi terror, capable of causing a storm of death from the shadows. His new mission was to create a brigade for the job. The Führer knew that this figure was a legend among the troops, so it would not be difficult for him to get volunteers. However, that did not mean that the task at hand was practically suicidal. It was very likely that those who joined would not return alive, and if they did, it would be with blood on their hands. Skorzeny had earned the respect of everyone for being at the forefront of operations such as the rescue of Mussolini. The Italian dictator had been overthrown in a coup d'état due to poor results in the war, and Hitler, as his main ally, ordered his men to help him. In that context, the leader of Operation Greif had been the executor of that feat that took place in September 1943, when a parachute assault allowed Mussolini to be freed and then escaped from confinement in a small plane. After his role in that mission, the SS lieutenant colonel became known as the most dangerous man in Europe. Tall and with a face marked by a scar that snaked from his cheek to the corner of his mouth, Skorzeny looked like the product of war itself. But his sinister appearance was only the preamble to his calculating mind, where deception and betrayal were the main tools. He did not care about conventional warfare. He was an expert in commando operations and raids where chaos could be turned into victory. However, Operation Greif was not just a mission to sow confusion. It also reflected the desperation of a Germany that was slowly dying, a last gasp before the Reich collapsed.
Hitler outlined his new plan for the Ardennes offensive and the role the lieutenant commander was to play in it. Skorzeny was to form a special command group, the Panzer Brigade 150, which would capture and destroy as many bridges in the Meuse River as possible before they were seized by the Allies.
When he was ordered to design and execute this mission, Skorzeny had no hesitation. This was his turf, and while he knew that Operation Greif would not bring redemption nor glorious victory, what captivated him was the ability to prolong the suffering of his enemies. In the brutal war, that was already a triumph for this ruthless character.
On October 25th, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command of Nazi Germany, issued an order requesting soldiers with knowledge of the English language. Volunteers from all branches of the German military responded to the appeal. Upon arrival to what the volunteers believed was a translation-based operation, the men were questioned by Nazi officers in English. The selected soldiers for the top-secret Panzer Brigade 150 were forced to sign a pledge of secrecy, punishable by death.
Skorzeny recruited 2,500 men, many of them soldiers hardened by years of slaughter and carnage on the fronts of Europe. But many others had been called up by the Nazi Party as a last resort in the face of the loss of troops. The first thing they had to learn was not how to fight, but how to be bloodthirsty traitors. They were taught to speak English with an American accent, to use the colloquial language of the Allied fighters, to imitate their gestures, their habits, their jokes. Any incorrect word or hesitant pause could cost them their lives. The training was not a preparation for glory, but for avoiding death. For the brand new members of the 150th Panzer Brigade, hell began before the operation began. They knew that the mask they wore was not just a disguise, but a sentence. Dressed in American uniforms, wearing fake Allied insignia, and driving vehicles camouflaged to look like American tanks. The mission was to penetrate deep into the enemy front. Once there was no turning back, and if they were captured, there would be no war tribunals or prisoner camps, only bullets or hanging. The preparation was brutal. The only way to survive was to erase all trace of their origin and become the adversary. But not everything was as simple as they imagined.
After a few weeks of training, the results were less than ideal. Out of 2,500 recruited volunteers, only 400 could speak basic English, and only 10 were fluent. The non-fluent soldiers were advised to mingle with the real Americans and pretend to be too agitated and overcome with fear to speak.
This was not only a danger to the soldier who was discovered, but it could compromise his comrades or even the entire plan. The other Nazis would not forgive him if he put them at risk. So the person who stumbled while in a trench with the enemy had to beware of both American and German weapons. Death did not only come from the enemy, betrayal was always lurking in the Nazi ranks. With few fighters truly ready to face the mission, emphasis was placed on the most prepared, who were taken to American prisoner camps. For days, they were forced to walk between the rows of American inmates that the German army had captured in previous campaigns, and they were mercilessly executed to make a clear message. The well-aimed shot in the back was enough to bathe the very ground the Germans walked on with blood, as a reminder of what awaited them if they failed. There was no compassion in the eyes of their instructors, nor in those of their comrades. Every soldier knew deep down that those marching beside him would be corpses before the operation was over. Every familiar face was a picture on a coffin about to be buried. They were aware that if the enemy discovered them, there would be only one end: the announced and most brutal of deaths. Despite the promises of death, everything was ready for the great German offensive in the Ardennes. That region, with extensive forests and hills on the borders with Belgium and France, was Adolf Hitler's last and bloody chance for victory. And Operation Greif was a fundamental piece for its success. On December 16, 1944, snow covered the landscape, whose tranquility was about to be interrupted by the screams and shots of the first onslaught of the Third Reich.
German tanks and troops stormed through the Ardennes forest, and the major German push was afoot. It caught the American troops completely off guard, and a vicious battle was underway to preserve the Allied foothold in Belgium. But while the intense fighting was going on, Skorzény's fake Americans slipped through the cracks and went behind the lines to complete their mission.
The Nazis seemed to have regained their ability to unleash terror among their enemies. At every step, they left a pile of corpses that dyed the landscape red, due to the blood that still flowed from their mortal wounds. Offering effective resistance became impossible for their adversaries, who did not understand the reason for the enormous disorganization among their troops. Chaos was more present than usual in the conflict. Something was happening, but no one understood it. Skorzény's commandos had infiltrated among the Allies, acting as shadows. They changed traffic signals, cut communication cables, and sabotaged ammunition depots. Their advance was slow, and as they penetrated deeper into enemy territory, the tension became unbearable. Any mistake could trigger instant death. A patrol with 3 Nazi soldiers, disguised as Americans, managed to reach the enemy's command posts. With a cold smile, the Germans exchanged greetings with officers whom they then murdered vilely after shaking hands. They knew they had one goal: to kill as many of the enemy as possible, and they did not hesitate to open fire whenever the opportunity presented itself. The corpses, torn apart by gunfire and surprise, were left piled up on the ground. Their faces were frozen in a mixture of horror and confusion. Meanwhile, for the soldiers of Operation Greif, deceit and brutality were mixed in the same act. They were no longer human. They had become ghosts of war, whose joy was to have the Americans discover their betrayal with an enemy rifle about to fire a bullet between their eyes. However, the presence of infiltrated Nazis finally became known, and with the news spreading through the Allied ranks, a new battle began within the fierce confrontation. What is striking at this point is that when the entire coalition of Western powers was alerted about what was happening, several commanders admitted that they had heard about that plan.
Now, amazingly, the Allies got word about the so-called top-secret plan, but they ignored it. They thought it was so absurd that it could only be false information intended to trick them.
As news of troops being attacked by infiltrating Germans piled up, American soldiers began to see enemies everywhere. Rumors of Nazis disguising themselves as their comrades made every familiar face a potential threat. Knowing they had been deceived generated immeasurable hatred that caused them to go on a bloody hunt for these adversaries. Security controls were tightened. Orders were issued to arrest any soldier whose identity was in doubt. Brutal interrogations quickly turned into summary trials. Any fighter who could not answer trivial questions about American culture was automatically considered an enemy. Executions became the norm, and the trenches were filled with bodies killed not for their actions but for doubt. Some bewildered by fear. Shot their own comrades if they seemed too quiet or slow to answer questions. Their hands became covered in blood, often innocent. Nothing was taken for granted anymore. With more than 200,000 Germans crossing the Ardennes forest, 3 American fighters fleeing in a jeep should not have raised any alarm. But the situation was extremely tense. A checkpoint signaled the vehicle to stop on a road in Belgium. The men in question were Charles Lawrence, Clarence van der Weert, and George Sensenbach. Or at least, that is how they presented themselves to their American colleagues who began a search. The search revealed 2 British-made Steen submachine guns, as well as several dollars and pounds in cash. Nothing seemed particularly suspicious until a deeper dialogue was established with the soldiers. Suddenly, the tension of the moment played against them. Their English became less fluent, and they made several very noticeable mistakes when expressing themselves. As if that were not enough, they were asked for a password that was being shared among the American forces. And they did not know it. That was the signal for the Americans to take their pistols and point them at the 3 men. Although the Germans tried desperately to convince them that they were colleagues, they suddenly discovered that beneath their uniforms they were wearing clothes with Nazi insignia. The farce was over. They turned out to be Sergeant Gunter Billing, Corporal Manfred Pernass, and Private Wilhelm Schmidt of the 150th Panzer Brigade. In case you still have any doubts, yes, these are 3 of the Nazis who were being brutally executed at the beginning of our video. Imagine the fear they felt when facing death, for at that moment Sergeant Billing confessed something that was still unknown. He said that one of the main objectives of Operation Greif was to infiltrate the supreme headquarters of the Allied forces. They were after the head of General Dwight Eisenhower. He was the main commander of the coalition, and the Germans had orders to kidnap or kill him. A real stab to the very heart of the enemy troops. This exploded like a bomb, and panic increased.
It provoked a complete overreaction from the American troops, bordering on paranoia. Security was tightened up beyond the pale. General Eisenhower even complained that he almost found himself a prisoner, and roadblocks were set up on nearly every road. American soldiers were instructed to question drivers of any vehicles on things only Americans would know. Things like baseball teams, movie stars, and towns. They would ask questions like, what is Sinatra's first name? Or who is the president's dog?
With controls tightened in the face of the Nazi plan to eliminate the Allied leader, Operation Greif began to collapse rapidly and brutally. Coalition forces soon began to identify and neutralize German commandos, and the General Ardennes offensive began to fail. Some of Skorzny's men, seeing themselves surrounded and with no chance of success, decided to surrender. A curious case was that of SS Captain Ernst Stielau, who surrendered to an American military policeman. He could no longer bear to live under the fear of being caught and decided to surrender before he went mad. However, the supposed American officer, who was supposed to put the handcuffs on him, turned out to be another German in disguise. In the end, both ended up becoming prisoners and disappeared from the radar. Probably, their fate was nothing more than torture and death, like that of the other traitors. Other commandos adopted desperate measures. Knowing that they had been discovered, they opted for suicide rather than fall into enemy hands. There was only one man left to find, Otto Skorzeny. He was in charge of a group of some 300 paratroopers who would seek to make a final attack on Allied headquarters to assassinate Eisenhower. He was determined to follow the Führer's orders to the very end. The mastermind behind the grand deception was hit by shrapnel from a grenade as he moved across the savage front line. He was seriously wounded in the head and was taken to a Berlin hospital. With the mission leader gone and the 150th Panzer Brigade falling apart, Operation Greif came to an end. Those who did not die in combat were captured and faced the most ruthless of revenges. The justice of the victors, imbued with spite, violence, and the desire to make the traitors pay by causing as much pain as possible. The soldiers were subjected to brutal interrogations, psychological torture, and summary executions. They were not considered prisoners, but spies and saboteurs, and the punishment for such crimes was clear: a gruesome death. Most commandos were promptly led to a firing squad. Shots rang out in front of their blindfolded eyes and their uniforms stained with deceit. As for Skorzeny, he was eventually captured by his enemies at the end of the war and taken prisoner. But in 1948, he managed to escape and settle in Spain with the help of former SS officers. The ruthless architect of the cruel betrayal lived quietly until his death in 1975 and never paid the price his men had faced. On January 25, 1945, the Battle of the Bulge ended in an Allied victory, and Nazism headed for imminent defeat. In many ways, the failed operation became a reflection of the general collapse of the Third Reich. Adolf Hitler's last hope had failed miserably. In the scene you just witnessed, that lone American soldier would end up forcing 250 men and 6 German tanks to retreat. It might seem like an exaggeration made for the movies. If we appeal to logic, there's no possibility that this could have happened. But what if I told you it did happen? And furthermore, that the protagonist of that scene was also the protagonist of those actions on the battlefield. In France in 1945, this man achieved such a feat, which would lead him to receive more medals than any other soldier, ally or enemy, and all before turning 21. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we'll tell you all about the heroic Audie Murphy, the most decorated soldier of the entire Second World War. Audie Murphy was born in a small town in Texas, United States, on June 22, 1925, into a very poor family. He was 10 years old when his father left home, leaving him, his mother, and his 11 siblings without financial support. He was forced to drop out of school to work in a cotton mill for $1 a day. By the time World War II broke out, at just 16 years old, his mother died of pneumonia. Several of his siblings were taken to orphanages, and he took care of those who remained. The family situation was so dire that he had to learn to hunt to obtain food. Little did he know, the skill Murphy acquired with the weapon would prove very useful in just a few years. After Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, which marked the United States' entry into the war, 17-year-old Murphy attempted to enlist in the Marine Corps. However, his height of 5 feet 5 inches was not sufficient for acceptance. The same thing happened in the Air Force. The Army remained his only option, but he was also rejected here, this time for being underage. This did not deter him. With the help of one of his sisters, he presented falsified documentation that made him appear old enough, and finally his entry was approved. Due to his small stature and youthful appearance, he was nicknamed Baby by his comrades in arms, but Murphy would soon demonstrate how erroneous it is to judge by appearances. He was assigned to the 15th Army Infantry Division's 3rd Division, which was stationed in North Africa. There he remained with his division until 1943, when he saw combat for the first time in Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. In that place, Murphy served as a runner, delivering messages to and from the front lines. This role did not prevent him from impressing his superiors with his skill with weapons and quick mind. It was on Italian soil where his extensive record of decorations would begin. At Salerno, he charged with only one companion against a German machine gun nest, killing its 5 enemies. A few weeks later, he led a small group of men in repelling a German attack. The high number of Allied casualties on the front lines meant that soldiers who stood out were quickly promoted. By December 1943, he was already a sergeant. Throughout his military career, Murphy was a constant victim of illnesses. For example, an outbreak of malaria prevented him from being in the initial landing that would begin the Battle of Anzio. This amphibious operation marked the beginning of one of the bloodiest campaigns on the Mediterranean front. Logistic errors, such as the few men employed and the absence of tanks, greatly complicated the achievement of planned objectives. The costly victory the Allies achieved paved the way to Rome, undermining the German occupation in the country. Both the Allies and the Axis forces suffered over 40,000 casualties, including dead and wounded. Let's now hear the testimony of a veteran who recalls what this forgotten battlefield was like.
You run out onto the beach, and we ran into deep water. Whereas you run into water up to your knees, and we ran into water and it went up to here. So you're getting panicking, throwing equipment about. And anyway, finally you get ashore, you're being fired at now, you see. If the bloke up there with a machine gun does a bit of spraying on you, you're likely to catch one. You get down as quick as you can and get off the beach. That was the first shooting I ever come across.
Barely recovered, Murphy returned to the fight, and after his first battle upon his return, he was promoted to staff sergeant. With the help of his platoon, he eliminated a tank crew and then blew it up with grenades. Shortly after, he successfully repelled a German attack. He was awarded the Bronze Star for his actions, the first of what would be an extensive record. A second bout of malaria put him in the hospital, but Murphy never stopped wanting to be on the front lines. The idea of asking for discharge never crossed his mind. Once recovered, he participated in August 1944 in Operation Dragoon, the lesser-known Allied amphibious invasion of France, carried out in the south of the country. In the early days of the attack, he killed 2 snipers and eliminated another machine gun nest himself, earning him the Distinguished Service Cross as a result. But his achievements were just beginning. In September, he was wounded in combat for the first time by a mortar explosion that injured his ankle, thus earning a Purple Heart. In October 1944, while fighting in the Lommel Quarry, Murphy achieved the incredible feat of winning 2 Silver Stars in 3 days. The first came when he faced a Nazi machine gun position, firing at his platoon. He killed 4 Germans and captured another 3. 3 days later, Murphy and his platoon were ambushed by their enemies and began to suffer casualties rapidly. While his comrades took cover, he crawled through the mud to a good position, eliminated 2 snipers, and then radioed mortar artillery fire. The skirmish lasted over an hour and ended with 15 Germans dead and 35 wounded. For the bravery and leadership shown in adversity, he received a battlefield promotion. Murphy was promoted to 2nd lieutenant at just 19 years old. 2 weeks later, he would receive a second wound that almost took him out of action. Deep in France, Murphy's platoon was attacked by German snipers. Guided by their brave leader, they managed to capture 2 enemies, but a hidden shooter managed to hit Murphy in the hip. Nevertheless, he killed his attacker with a shot between the eyes. The wound didn't seem very serious at first, but soon developed gangrene. Let's hear the testimony of one of his comrades.
He wasn't bleeding very bad, and he was prodding his prisoners along, and he was making them carrying the radio with him. And I said, "Murphy, I hope you can stay back. Good luck to you." And he's got a grin that gets you, grin, and a happy grin, a baby-face grin. And I really didn't expect him to see him again.
For a month, Murphy couldn't return to the front. But when he did, he performed his greatest feat, one of the most outstanding of the entire war. On January 14, 1945, he rejoined his division. They were in the French town of Colmar, very close to the German border. For months, this region had been in Nazi hands, so their presence was strong. If they could drive the Germans out of here, the path to Berlin would be one step closer. Their target was the village of Holzwihr, where the Germans were entrenched. For 10 days, Murphy's company fought against Axis forces, inching closer step by step to the small village and suffering continuous casualties. By January 24th, of the over 100 men who had set out for Colmar, only 40 remained fit to fight. All the officers except Murphy had fallen. A strong German counterattack that same day wounded him in both legs, but he was not evacuated and the enemy was repelled. While waiting for reinforcements on January 26th, he was appointed commander not only of the platoon, but of the entire company. Even in the adverse conditions his division faced, he was ordered by his superiors to hold the line north of Holzwihr. The ground was so frozen that trenches could not be dug, and he was informed that there would be no reinforcements available. He had 40 men, 5 armored vehicles, and 2 M10 Wolverine tank destroyers. For anyone, this would be an almost impossible scenario, but Murphy was not deterred. He set up his command post in a trench near one of the tank destroyers, from where he could control the battlefield and awaited the arrival of his enemies. What happened next would go down in history as one of the most impressive individual military feats ever performed. Even to this day, it remains one of the greatest displays of willpower, courage, and heroism seen on the battlefield. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon on January 26th, the German attack began. It was preceded by artillery bombardment. After this, 6 tanks and 250 men dressed in white emerged from the village, heading towards the Americans. The tank destroyers immediately began firing upon seeing the enemy, but their projectiles bounced off the German armor without causing damage. The situation worsened when one of the German vehicles hit one of the American Wolverines head-on, killing its crew and rendering it useless. The other tank destroyer managed to hold off the enemy advance for a while, killing several men with its mounted machine guns, but a misstep caused it to get stuck in one of the trenches dug, with no firing angle. Murphy saw that the situation was desperate. With the vehicles out of action, his men had no chance of holding off the German attack. He ordered his soldiers to fall back to a safer position within the forest. Meanwhile, he would stay at his command post, directing Allied artillery via his radio. Despite the discontent of his comrades in arms, they obeyed. Let's hear the testimony of a historian who speaks about how Murphy thought and reacted.
He simply reacted on adrenaline and gut reactions of attacking, aggressive action. He took it. He picks up grenades, he finishes off the Germans, he grabs a German machine gun, he continues to fire on the Germans that are still on the hill, and in the process he secures the position virtually single-handed.
Murphy fired and fired upon the German troops, while bullets and projectiles flew over his head. When the ammunition in his carbine ran out, he realized he could no longer do anything and that he had to fall back. But at that moment, his eyes fell upon the destroyed tank destroyer. Although the vehicle was impossible to operate, the .50 caliber turret was still functioning. With that, Murphy could hold off the Nazi advance. However, there were disadvantages. He would be an easy target for tanks. Furthermore, the tank destroyer was on fire, and if the flames reached the fuel or ammunition, the vehicle would explode. Despite the danger, Murphy decided that the risk was worth it. With the courage that characterized him, he climbed onto the tank destroyer and began to machine gun the Germans. Those in the open field were quickly swept away, and the others were forced to take cover. The German tanks added their fire to that of the infantry, but miraculously they failed to hit the vehicle. The smoke coming from the tank destroyer had the effect of hiding its position. This, coupled with the overwhelming sound of artillery and gunfire, made it difficult for the Germans to identify where the machine gun fire was coming from. Even when 2 artillery shells hit so close to the vehicle that they caused him a concussion and reopened the wounds in his legs from the previous day, Murphy didn't stop firing. For an hour, he kept the trigger squeezed, while the Germans kept advancing despite their casualties. But Murphy's luck persisted. The sky, cloudy since the attack began to clear. This made it possible for the Allied bomber planes stationed nearby to be prepared to assist the brave soldier. When notified by radio, Murphy marked the position of the enemy troops with smoke grenades. Even when the Nazi soldiers were dangerously close, he continued instructing the planes to fire, risking being hit himself. Assailed from the air by the bombs of the planes and swept by machine gun fire, the German infantry began to retreat. The tanks, without support, followed suit shortly after. At that moment, the radio through which Murphy had commanded the artillery stopped working. Exhausted and bleeding from his wounds, but with his mission accomplished, he got off the tank and began to walk towards his comrades. Barely reaching the forest, he heard the vehicle explode. He had been saved by mere seconds. After such a feat, any soldier could take a break without a trace of guilt. But Audie Murphy was not just any soldier. He refused to be evacuated for his wounds, and instead immediately organized a counterattack. On January 27th, one day after Murphy's heroic actions, the town of Holzwihr was in American hands. By the 28th, the entire Colmar area was free of Germans. In February, Murphy was promoted to first lieutenant and awarded the Legion of Merit for his actions in the Mediterranean and European campaigns. Thanks to his new rank, he was transferred from the front lines to regimental headquarters and did not return to combat, perhaps much to his regret. In June 1945, with the war in Europe now over, he was awarded the Medal of Honor for his heroic actions on the outskirts of Holzwihr, on that fateful January 26th. The official citation reads, "Lieutenant Murphy's indomitable courage and refusal to yield a single inch of ground saved his company from possible encirclement and destruction, enabling them to hold their position in the forest." In addition to the Medal of Honor, Murphy was awarded 2 Bronze Stars, the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, the Legion of Merit, and 3 Purple Hearts. Beyond his country's awards, Murphy received the Legion of Honor and 2 War Crosses from the French Army and a War Cross from the Belgian Army. Audie Murphy thus became the most decorated soldier of the entire Second World War and of United States history, with 241 confirmed kills and dozens of captured prisoners. As incredible as it may seem, he was only 20 years old. Let's listen to him speaking about the end of the war.
When you heard the war was over, what was your first thought or reaction?
Well, coming home again, I started to think about home for a change, which we didn't dare think of before because, as you know, you live from day to day, minute to minute in most cases. And suddenly I was a little frightened. Strange as it might seem, I didn't know what I'd do when I got home, and I suddenly felt just a little empty inside and a little lonely about the whole thing. Although I was very happy the war was over, I suddenly didn't feel that I had a home.
After the war, Murphy returned to Texas, but his adventures wouldn't end there. In 1945, he was invited to Hollywood, where just a few years later, he would begin a film career almost as impressive as his medal count. He appeared in over 40 movies, mostly war films and westerns, often starring in them. He even played the lead role in To Hell and Back, where he portrayed himself during his battles in France, as we saw at the beginning of the video. This movie became the biggest success of Universal Studios at the time of its release. He balanced his acting career with a second, thankfully quieter military career. He joined the Texas Army National Guard, where he trained troops destined for the Korean War. Although Murphy sought to be transferred to the fight, his division was never deployed. But the battles and tragedies endured also took their toll. In his post-war life, Murphy suffered from insomnia and depressive episodes. He revealed that the only way he could sleep soundly was with a loaded pistol under his pillow. He also experienced abrupt mood swings. According to his wife, once while watching news of German orphans on television, he cried out of guilt. He was also involved in several violent altercations, nearly ending his opponent's life on one occasion. In the 1960s, he developed an addiction to Placidil, a sedative that alleviated his nightmares. But being Murphy, he locked himself in a hotel room alone to overcome his dependency. He succeeded. Throughout his life, he was an advocate for the rights of veterans of the Korean and Vietnam Wars, raising awareness about what soldiers suffered on the front lines. He never hesitated to speak about his own post-traumatic stress, then known as battle fatigue. He urged the government to pay more attention and allocate more resources to studying the effects of war on soldiers' health. As was customary in his life, he succeeded. On May 28, 1971, Murphy died when the private plane he was flying in with 5 other people crashed into a mountain. He was 46 years old. His birthday is known in Texas as Audie Murphy Day. Currently, Murphy remains an example for any soldier of the United States. His courage, leadership, and ability to face adversity are an inspiration to military personnel in every corner of the world. Below, we can see former U.S. President Barack Obama remembering Murphy at a Medal of Honor ceremony.
You lived up to the standards of the most decorated American soldier of World War II, Audie Murphy, who famously repelled an overwhelming enemy attack by himself for one simple reason: they were killing my friends.
We're reaching the end of the video, and we'd like to ask you, what aspect of Audie Murphy's story surprises you the most? Leave your response in the comments section below, and make sure to subscribe to our channel to stay updated on more military events that have left a mark on history.
tyrants fall, disorder sweeps over the land. Riot and bloodshed multiply. And sometimes, mistaking vengeance for justice, the people seek out their former torturers to vent their rage upon them.
When talking about World War II, the Allies, especially the US forces, are often portrayed as the great heroes of the conflict. This is particularly true when Americans themselves recount the story of how they saved all of Europe and defeated Hitler. However, more than once these men confused justice with vengeance and committed bloody war crimes. From unjustified massacres to rape and sexual harassment against women, US troops showed that they could sink to the same level as the Italian fascists or the Nazis themselves. But since history is always written by the victors, according to the laws imposed by the Allied countries after their victory, most of these crimes were neither judged at Nuremberg nor any other tribunal. With the impunity granted by public opinion for being on the opposite side of the world's most evil man, the US Army concealed its most despicable acts for decades. But today, we will reveal the dark truth about the brutality of the Americans during World War II. Let's begin. It is difficult to pinpoint the exact moment when American troops unleashed their inner beast and decided to commit the bloodiest war crimes. However, we will start by highlighting some of their most violent actions, with the massacres they carried out against unarmed enemies and the civilian population of Italy. The first notable event took place in July 1943, when the 7th Fleet of the United States invaded Sicily. During this historic incursion, several events foreshadowed the illegal actions of the troops under Lieutenant General Patton. The first are known as the Biscari massacres. On July 14th, when the 1st Battalion of the 180th Infantry Regiment landed on the island, it immediately marched southwest with the intention of capturing the air bases near the town of Santo Pietro. Once there, they had to face the resistance of the fascist army, accompanied by a handful of Nazis. The Allies triumphed and captured 35 Italians and 2 Germans, who were executed as unarmed prisoners of war, with a close-range shot directly to the heart. On that same day, but on the other side of Sicily, a bloody event was about to occur. 4 days before the battle at the airbase, Company C of the same battalion had moved to the Dorillo River, east of the Biscari airport, to contain a mortar and machine gun attack, while their comrades liberated the airfield. Captain John T. Compton held the position for 3 days without sleeping. As he himself stated, he was too excited and alert to get any rest. On the 4th day, July 14th, they began receiving shots from an extremely accurate sniper who managed to wound or kill 12 of Compton's 34 men. In an attempt to locate the sniper's vantage point, soldier Raymond C. Marlowe ran towards the source of the shots when he encountered an Italian soldier armed with a rifle. Marlowe raised his weapon and ordered his enemy to surrender. The Mussolini soldier ducked into a small dugout, but after a few minutes emerged with his hands up, accompanied by 35 other Italians, several of whom were dressed in civilian clothes. Marlowe escorted them up the hill to his outpost and informed his squad leader, Sergeant Hare, about the prisoners. When Hare asked Compton what to do with the prisoners, Compton, without flinching, replied, "Shoot them all." The men of Company C assembled a squad of 11 soldiers and proceeded to execute the 36 prisoners of war, who died amid screams of horror and pleas. Some tried to escape but were shot in the back. In both incidents, the superiors of the American officers responsible for the massacres hesitated about whether to report the facts or keep them secret, but eventually, they sent the reports. When American General Bradley learned of the bloody acts, he informed General Patton, who would leave a note in his diary about his thoughts on the matter. I told Bradley that it was probably an exaggeration, but that in any case he should tell the officer to certify that the dead were snipers or had attempted to escape or something like that, as it would cause a scandal in the press and also anger civilians. Anyway, they are dead, so nothing can be done about it. As criminals say, the dead do not speak, so these murders went unpunished for many years, and most of those responsible were never judged. However, the Biscari tragedy, which left 73 dead, would be nothing compared to what the United States Army would do a year later. When the Americans stormed the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, they arrived on the continental territory of occupied Europe like a tide of freedom, promising to end the inhumane Nazi invasion in France. It is clear that initially they were received as heroes, praised by Parisians as they drove their jeeps through the streets of the city, greeted by the civilian population. But things would not take long to change, and a few weeks later, French citizens were already talking about the new reign of terror of the Americans, who seemed to have simply replaced the Nazis. According to local reports, U.S. troops were driving drunk, causing accidents in the cities, and mistreating the community. But the worst were the sexual abuses committed against women. To put it in context, during World War II, some French cities had acquired a widespread reputation for vice and pleasure. During the occupation, the Nazis increased the number of available prostitutes to an astonishing 10,000 women, working actively to satisfy the invaders. Of course, some brothels amassed fortunes, while in other, more precarious spaces, the women worked out of obligation. In the worst cases, they served their clients at gunpoint. This was because Adolf Hitler, fearing that his troops might develop emotional attachments to local women, preferred that soldiers satisfy their sexual needs without engaging their emotions. But no matter what language they speak, men always boast about their supposed conquests, even if the first date is really an SS-organized raid. Thus, the reputation of French women as almost divinely created to please men spread beyond territorial borders. This led the Americans, when they entered the territory, to believe they were arriving in a land of carnal excess and lust. In Normandy alone, the gateway to the European country, 208 rapes and 30 homicides by Uncle Sam's men against the civilian population were recorded. In a very short time, the French began to say that while with the Germans they had to hide, with the Americans they had to hide the women. But the minds of General Patton's troops had been shaped both by the rumors spread and by the opinions coming from the United States. During the liberation of France, the military set up a brothel of dubious legality near the village of Saint-Renan. This was to be used as a sort of cover to counter the wave of accusations against Allied soldiers for their grotesque acts. However, the remedy was worse than the disease, and the place closed just 5 hours later, as the High Command considered that the existence of a brothel run by the military would cause dissent in public opinion. Evidently, the Americans entered Paris seeking relaxation, and the post-traumatic stress of the population would not prevent them. According to some data collected by various researchers and historians, U.S. forces raped about 4,500 French women between 1944 and 1945. And if you think this number is brutal, the truth is that the troops wearing the supposed colors of liberty did a lot of damage in France, but far exceeded it in Germany. While there are reports that indicate that about 10,000 German women and girls were raped, there are few records that give a detailed account of these events. However, the account of journalist Osmar White, an Australian war correspondent who accompanied American troops during the war, has survived to this day. He wrote about it as follows. After the fighting had passed on German soil, there were many rapes by combat troops and by those immediately following them. The incidents varied from unit to unit according to the attitude of the commanding officer. In some cases, the offenders were identified, tried by military courts, and punished. The legal branch of the military was reticent. However, it admitted that some soldiers had been shot for brutal or perverted sexual offenses against German women, particularly if the soldiers were black. However, it is a fact that many women were raped by white Americans. No action was taken against the culprits. A report circulated in one quarter that a certain very distinguished commander made the joke, "Copulation without conversation does not constitute brotherhood." In war, above all, it is evident that emotions can compromise soldiers, which was clear in the case of France and Germany. However, the Allies saw Europeans as similar people. So imagine the extent of the violence that these types of crimes had when they also involved racism. This is the case of the sexual abuses committed by the Allies during the occupation of Japan, where cases of were recorded that ranged from girls under 10 years old to elderly women of 80 years old. These cases were particularly nefarious due to the deep xenophobia that existed in the West, who allowed themselves to have bloodthirsty, barbaric, and animalistic attitudes towards Asian women. During the first 10 days of the occupation, some 1,000 rapes by the Allies against Japanese women were reported. Although this was reduced by the intervention of British and Canadian officers, it is estimated that in the following months, 40 abuses were committed daily. Some commanders even encouraged them, as was the case of General Robert L. Eichelberger, who allowed, in his own words, his boys to relax with local girls and adolescents. However, the military leadership was concerned about the sexual activity of its men, so in early 1946, it decided to prohibit prostitution in most of the subjugated areas of Japan. This only encouraged violence and sexual access by the troops towards Japanese women. On April 4th, 50 soldiers broke into a hospital in Omori Prefecture and raped 77 women, including a mother who had just given birth. In a blood frenzy, the soldiers murdered the newborn baby during the assault. On April 11th, 40 American soldiers cut the telephone lines in a residential area in the city of Nagoya and simultaneously raped a large number of women, aged between 10 and 55. By mid-1946, sexual abuses were reported daily at 300. Of course, outside the occupied zones, nothing was known about the war crimes carried out by the Allies. There was, as in liberated Europe, a deep spirit of institutional censorship on the part of the high commands of all Western armies. On September 10, 1945, Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Allied powers, had issued press codes declaring illegal the publication of reports or statistics contrary to the objectives of the occupation, with a clear intention of sweeping under the rug the most terrible acts committed by his soldiers. Needless to say, the punishment for violating these prohibitions was extremely severe, and even mentioning censorship resulted in formal penalties. But the horrors did not stop at the terrible sexual abuses. There remains another war crime unaddressed by the United States. Americans arrived at Dachau on April 29, 1945, towards the end of the camp's evacuation. As they advanced towards one of the darkest places in occupied Europe, they encountered a transport with 4,000 prisoners, which they failed to intercept in time, and it continued towards Germany. After this incident, the Americans decided to quicken their pace. The 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions covered 60 kilometers along the Danube, arriving much earlier than anticipated by Hitler's troops. It was Sunday at noon. The camp was completely quiet, and the SS guards were doing their shift, monitoring from their towers the movements of the prisoners still remaining in the Dachau camp. A chilling scream shattered the calm of the day. "The Americans! The Americans!" The man ran towards the gate, in a vain attempt to attract the soldiers' attention, but one of the guards aimed at him from behind, killing him instantly. In any case, it was unnecessary. The U.S. infantry had already spotted the towers and began shooting at the German officers. The SS members, being vastly outnumbered, decided to come down from their positions, surrender their weapons, and unconditionally surrender. After the first guards had knelt, an American soldier approached and without a second thought, executed them on the spot with his pistol. But this was taken as an isolated incident until the Americans finally entered the camp. The sight of the macabre and brutal acts that the Nazis had carried out in Dachau unleashed a wave of executions by the Americans. The reason was no longer with them, only a bloodthirsty thirst for revenge. Tower B, the second lookout post, was also the scene of a systematic shooting of German guards who, after surrendering, were executed with a well-aimed shot to the head. Lieutenant Walsh captured 4 German soldiers, whom he forced into a freight car. There were about 120 Jewish corpses in it, and after keeping the guards there for a while, observing what they themselves had done, he murdered them in cold blood. Later, about a dozen prisoners of war were shot in a coal depot by a 19-year-old gunner who was found in a deep state of shock, crying and screaming that they had tried to escape, although no one would agree with him. Before the end of the first day, madness took hold of the men at Dachau. After a long time, and at the end of his life, the anesthesiologist Wilsey, who belonged to the medical corps of the battalion that carried out the Dachau massacre, recalled the events and attributed the macabre events to a kind of delirium. For him, the horrors that the American soldiers had to witness, added to the stress of war, were too much for their psyche. On the morning of the second day, the Americans forced about 50 SS soldiers to strip naked in the open air and make the Nazi salute, with their arms raised toward the sun, while they threw buckets of ice-cold water at them. This practice had been carried out by the guards themselves, with the Jews and other prisoners before. However, there was a condition that if they lowered their arms for any reason, they would be executed. All 50 Germans were shot before the end of the afternoon. Within a few days, the Dachau massacre had been completed. Although official figures, accepted by the United States government, suggest that the German prisoners killed were between 50 and 100, some other sources indicate that there may have been more than 500. General Eisenhower celebrated the liberation of the camp and announced that 32,000 prisoners had been rescued, while American troops had killed some 300 enemies. The conditions under which these deaths occurred, however, became known almost 70 years later, when those responsible could no longer be judged. All these facts show us that the Allies were not held accountable at Nuremberg alongside the Nazis for their atrocities against humanity, and the great majority of the criminals who acted in pursuit of their wildest instincts died old in freedom, considered veteran heroes. However, there are still many researchers and historians who allow these stories to cross the barrier of ostracism and remind us that it does not matter which side you are on. There are those who pursue noble ideals, but also those who take up arms and harm the innocents they swore to protect, just to try to capture a spark of that useless power that fades as quickly as tears in the rain. Thank you so much for following us to the end. If you liked our content, don't forget to like the video and follow our channel. See you next time.